All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to our Viti 301 class. Tonight, we're going to talk about climate for viticulture, and this will be a super fun presentation. For our reading reference, we have Chapter 4 in both textbooks, the General Viticulture textbook as well as the Grape Grower's Handbook, and I have a plethora of online sites sorted on this as well. So just a little overview for what we'll talk about tonight. We'll talk about the importance of climate in viticulture, how climate influences the grape quality and wine characteristics, an overview of the key factors we discuss. We'll also explore how different climates will shape wine production across various regions, and then ultimately we'll discuss climate change and its impact on viticulture today. So very nice to be keeping it relevant to today's stuff. Okay, so climate's impact on vineyards, right? So viticulture is highly dependent on environmental conditions, right? Makes sense. The plants that we produce, if you have a green thumb, you'll know that, whether it's a rainy day, a sunny day, or if you get hit by a hail or an early freeze, all these things directly impact what we're trying to grow or what grows naturally in our area, right? So this directly affects, for viticulture, the health of the vine, the grape development, but also the wine style and quality as well. So all really important things for the wine industry, right? So key climate factors that we're going to talk about will be temperature, of course, rainfall and humidity, sunshine hours, and also wind influence. All these things play very key roles. Okay, temperature. So temperature is the most important, one of the most important, definitely with the biggest factor that influences viticulture, right? So ideal temperature range, and it depends, right? Because we have think of coastal versus foothills versus valley, it can be very different, right? But generally speaking, these are very general terms. The ideal temperature range for a grapevine for the growing season is between 77 and 99 degrees. So that's maximum daytime temperature, right? So anything with temperatures below this range will cause your vegetative growth to be limited. It's going to be very hard for your vines to grow. The health will be stunted for sure. Temperatures above this range reduce the grape photosynthesis rate due to an increase in respiration. So we talked about this last presentation, how if the plant is experiencing extreme heat and the stomata are open and it's releasing too much water vapor, they will actually those guard cells will deflate and close to retain the water in the plant, and then so they won't be able to perform photosynthesis because they can't have that gas exchange to the stomata. So this is a great little add-on to what we talked about in our last presentation. Another little thing for you to remember is that if it gets really, really hot during your growing season, like above 102 degrees for multiple days in a row, the grapevines will just shut down. So you'll notice this if you're doing grape samples before harvest, if you're just getting hit by extreme heat during the late summer, early fall, which we sometimes do here in El Dorado County. When it's that hot for that long, you'll notice that the metrics on your grapes do not change. The plant is not producing any more sugar in the grapes. The acids aren't changing. You're at a complete standstill in development. So it's not fantastic. You can try to irrigate to supplement, but you'll just flood out the sugar in your grapes. But at 102 degrees, grapevines will shut down. It's just too hot. Another thing to consider for a climate is something called diurnal temperature variation. This is something that's very helpful and very important to grapevines. And, most areas talk about having a diurnal temperature variation, which is great. All that means in fancy talk, into simpler terms, is it's the difference between the highest temperature of the day and the lowest temperature of the night. So that temperature swings allows the plant to move into different types of metabolism and to produce the best quality of fruit. So having a diurnal temperature variation is very important. Next, we're going to talk about growing degree days, sometimes referred to as GDD. So this is just the accumulated heat over the course of the whole season. So that's something we'll talk about with the Winkler Index in just a second. Temperature extremes, not ideal. Nothing in an extreme should be good, right? So if you have extreme frost or extreme cold, can lead to frost, which can kill buds Excessive heat can lead to unbalanced fruit or the complete stunting of the grape maturity, right? So just like we're talking about at 102 degrees, grapevines will shut down. So that's kind of an overview of just the general things to think about for temperature. So when we talk about frost, we lean towards the cold side of that spectrum, right? There's a lot of things that vineyards do to combat against frost. So it usually involves creating warm air or a recirculation of warm air, right? And so we know that warm air rises. That's why the hot air balloons are always so exciting, right? So warm air always rises. Cool air tends to sink. It's much more dense. And that can be potentially what damages the buds in your vineyard. So if it's still, right now, it's just the very beginning of February, so it's still in the dormant season of your vines. So any frost right now will probably be okay. We did experience some nice warm weeks in January this year, which was pretty bizarre. For the most part, the vineyards haven't seen any bud break yet, but it would be a really bad thing for us to have a freeze if those buds were open. So that's going to be something to look for. So you don't have to do all these precautions if your buds haven't opened yet, but you will have to do these things if your buds are open and they're susceptible to frost damage, right? So some of these things that we can do include heaters. So there are many vineyards in France and even the United States that use these little fire pits that go up and down the rows, and they just help to keep it from freezing on the vines. And these vines are very short, they're lowered to the ground, and so these little fires just keep them warm at night to prevent any frost from going over them. So that's creating warm air. Then we have the recirculation of warm air. So some vineyards will use like wind machines and helicopters, and it's basically to push out all the cold air and keep it from settling and freezing over. So if you can keep that air in motion, you can prevent frost damage as well. There are also plows, and this is really common in some Asian countries where they'll actually they'll use like a plow to bury the vines in the dirt to protect them during the dormant season and to keep them from freezing. There's also overhead sprinklers, and this seems really counterintuitive because you're fighting frost with ice. So ice freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So ice is very insulating, right? That's why igloos are a thing. So overhead sprinklers will create a barrier of ice around your buds and around your vines that will actually insulate it and protect it from dropping below 32. So even though it might be colder than 32 outside, it'll actually insulate it. And then as it melts, it's an exothermic reaction that releases heat. And so the ice around it will melt, and then the bud will be preserved and ready to go and safe once you've got past that frosty season. So that's kind of a cool thing. A lot of local wineries will employ overhead sprinklers here in the Sierra foothills, so that is something that you will see. Cover crops and cold air drainage are also things that we can utilize as well, but you can look more into those if you like. But lots of things. Okay, rainfall and humidity will be the next topic for climate, right? So we want rain, we don't want too much, we don't want too little, right? So what does that mean for us? So if we have too much rain, consequences could be dilution of the flavors in the grapes, but also an increased risk of mildew. So this powdery white mildew here on this top image is a great example of what that looks like. And then also botrytis is another extreme as well. This, once you've got it, it will totally affect your grapes. There's lots of spraying that needs to be done to prevent this from happening at very specific times and dosage rates and quantities. Also, just a lack of air flow will also make you much more prone to that as well. So that's too much rain. If you have too little rain, it can cause drought stress on your vines. They can have a hard time producing healthy berries. They'll be smaller berries, but they can also be much more concentrated flavors in the wine. So this can be manipulated to a positive way, but also you don't want to be stressing out your vines too much where it could be affecting their longevity of life, right? There's a very fine balance to do. Here in this bottom image, we have a photo of thermal imaging for water stress in vineyards. So even though like you might have a block of fruit, different soil types, drainage abilities of that soil, if you have repairs that need to be done in your sprinkler or irrigation system, there could be a whole lot of things, right? So something that happens in vineyards is sometimes you'll get wildlife coming through, like coyotes or even boars, depending where you're at, right? And if you have a drip system, they love to bite right into it because it's a water source, right? They can smell the water, they can sense the water, and they're like, great, a tasty drink for myself. So they'll go through and they'll bite the irrigation, and then all of a sudden you have this massive leak in your vineyard, right? So viticulturists are always viticulturists are always going through the vineyard, repairing irrigation, and checking for leaks or damages or anything like that. So it's a constant battle. So that's why you see in this thermal imaging, we see the green spots of the vineyard, and that's actually good. That means that's well watered. There's very low water stress. The areas that are yellow and red is the highest water stress, and I think even this purple too. And then yellow is still stressed, but less severe. And the reason that we know this through thermal imaging is because if a plant has adequate water, the leaves are actually cooler than the ambient air. If there's very low water, if they're very dried out, the leaf will actually be much warmer than it should be, the leaf itself. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So that's where the thermal imaging comes in for water stress specifically, right? So you might have to irrigate depending on where your vineyard is. So California, lots of irrigation. Australia, lots of irrigation. Some other parts of the world, maybe not so much, right? So it's good to know. So how do you know if your vines do or do not have enough water, right? So one, we can use a pressure chamber, which will measure your leaf water potential and just tell you how much water is present in the leaf, and then you'll know based off of that potential number if it's in a good, happy zone or if it needs more irrigation, right? We also have other sources too, right? Other methods like visual observations, which can be really hard sometimes because some vines are very expressive when they're stressed out and some vines are not. I kind of like think, when I think about this, I think of like dogs sometimes. Like sometimes pets will be uncomfortable, but they won't say anything or show any signs. So it just depends on the variety. It depends on the pet you have. Some pets are very vocal when they're uncomfortable. It just depends. So visual observations, not very reliable, right? Soil moisture sensors are fantastic. You just have a sensor in your soil and it just tells you how moist it is, and then you can go based off of that as well. There's also thermal imaging like we just talked about right here. So leaves will get hot if they are too stressed out. Okay, moving on to sunshine hours. So just like we learned about when we were much younger, right? How plants need water and sun and nutrients to survive, right? The sunshine thing is a very big deal for grapes because it actually is involved, one, with photosynthesis, right? So it helps to produce the sugar that goes into the fruit, but also the rest of the vine, powering all those foods. But also it affects the acid retention and phenolic development. So sunlight is what gives grapes this beautiful dark blue, purpley, black color, right? So, I always refer to them as red grapes because we use them for red wine. Those are just the simple winemaker terms. But if you're going to become a somm, they refer to them as black grapes, etc. So the beautiful color that comes in the skins of those grapes is due to UV radiation. It actually triggers the color development in the skins. It acts as a protectant from UV. So the more color you have in the skins, the more flavor that you'll have in the wine. And the fancy word for that is just phenolics. Phenolics are color, which is more flavor in the wine, especially if you're making red wine because you're fermenting on those skins and extracting those flavors. So if you have more sun, it typically means richer, riper wines. So we really equate that to New World regions. New World meaning the United States, Australia winemaking, right? So we have very fruity, intense wines, whereas sometimes in like Europe, the wines can be a little more leaner, lower alcohol, lighter bodied, and a little more elegant and nuanced, right? Because it's kind of lighter, but here in California, it's a little bit different. So anything else I wanted to say on this slide? 7 to 8 hours of sunshine is best for grapevines. They are very happy in completely full sun. You don't have to worry about planting a vineyard in any partial sun or anything. Grapevines are happy to be out there basking in it. So that's fun. Okay, so we talked about sunshine. Now we're going to talk about wind. Wind is a big deal. We might not completely understand it because in the Sierra foothills, it's actually not extreme. We don't get really much extreme winds in our parts. But in areas that do get some strong winds, it can really dry out your vines. It can cause physical damage or even slow the ripening. So really not ideal to have extreme winds. Moderate winds are nice. That's what we have here in the Sierra foothills. This will reduce humidity, so keep you from getting that powdery mildew we saw the picture of a couple slides back. And it'll also help prevent diseases. So you think about the canopy of a grapevine, how it goes over onto itself, and it kind of creates think of it as like an armpit, right? Sometimes it can get pretty humid under that if there's not any proper airflow. So having the airflow going through the vineyard under the canopy of that vine will prevent any of those diseases from happening, right? So wind is especially significant on coastal or exposed areas, but sometimes you can have situations where other topography like valleys can amplify the effects and create a funnel to channel the air through, right? So a really good example of this is the Mistral wind of the Rhone Valley. It's a cold, dry north or northwest wind that blows down through the Rhone Valley to the Mediterranean, and it can reach speeds up to 56 miles per hour. So how this happens is we have a system of high pressure and low pressure, and it just creates this force that just blows through France, and it's pretty intense, right? So having vineyards, and also because this is valley, right? This is a valley area, so it just picks up, and it's almost like you're snow sledding. It just picks up and whoop, goes right through the whole area. So it's very important to have vineyards that are set up in a way that have barriers to protect them from the wind, or have a way to protect the vines from being completely damaged, right? So it may not seem like enough, but here's a picture of some trees, how they have formed and grown over the years because of these winds that come through the region, and it's pretty intense. So how do viticulturists work around extreme wind conditions, right? So one could be the planting orientation of your vineyard. So you could have your vineyard rows in strategic directions. If you're going to plant your vineyard perpendicular to the wind, it will help a lot to tamper that. I mean, the first couple of rows are going to get banged up from that extreme wind, but they're going to take the brunt force to protect the rest of that block, right? If you were to plant your vineyard parallel to the wind, where the wind blows right through it, then it doesn't tamper the wind, it just passes right through. It can cause a lot of damage or be difficult for your vines to be successful, right? So another thing you can do is you can plant physical windbreaks. So this could be poplars, hawthorn, or Italian alders. There are other options too. You'll see this in some areas of like Italy, even in California. You'll see these beautiful trees planted to create a physical barrier to protect the vineyard, right? And sometimes it really is for like cosmetic, fanciful landscaping, but for the most part, these in a real world application, when you see them planted like this is an actual defense for the vines. So these are called windbreaks because they break wind. So yeah, that's an option. And then also you can train your vines to be in a position specifically to protect it for the wind. So a good example of this would be pergola. Pergola is the training that you could basically walk under. It's this big overhead training so the wind can just funnel under it, which would work out very nice. Or you could do vines that are planted very low to the ground, so that way they're not being thrashed so much. But there are a couple more examples that I really enjoy that people don't really know about. And these are very extreme methods, but these are great examples how regions have adapted to their climate and to the wind to make their vines successful. So I have this linked here if you guys want to see, but first example would be the Canary Islands. So they've actually dug pits before planting the vines in them to help against the wind. So the wind just scrapes over the top of the pits, but the vines below are just fine. I can't even imagine how long and how hard the work is to deal with these vines individually by climbing down and up these pits. I'm sure that's enough to keep you very much in good shape. But just so bizarre to see that something like this exists. And this is not an AI photo. This is a real place with real vineyard work that looks like this. My other favorite example is in Santorini in Greece. They use what's called a basket training system. So it looks like all these little bird nests or like Easter egg baskets are growing along the coastline because it just gets ravaged by wind. So they actually train the shoots that become canes, right, into this nest configuration, and then the grapes grow right in the center like a little Easter basket. It's so cool. So this is what they have all along the coastline in Santorini for how they grow grapes. So lots of viticulturists being very creative, lots of wonderful things people can do. It's also a cool way to just realize that there isn't like a one system fits all for vineyards. Like you really have to have a fantastic understanding of the land, the wind, all of these factors that come into place to make a successful farm. You know, you are a farmer at the end of the day, so it's really cool to see what people do. And they've been doing that for a long time. That's not new technology by any means. It's just different than what we're used to seeing, you know, here in California. So it's cool. Okay, so climate classifications in viticulture. Now we've talked about that, let's move on to some of the more fun scientific stuff. So for climates, we'll talk about the difference between cool climate and warm climate wines. That's a very important thing to understand. We'll also talk about the Winkler Index and its classification system. Then we'll talk about some examples of famous wine regions in different climate zones too. So if you've been in my other classes, you've definitely seen this slide before. I think this is just a great example visually of what the general differences are between cooler and warmer condition or climate wines. So generally speaking, cooler conditions, think of the coast, right? Think of varieties like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, maybe even Riesling, Pinot Grigio. So think of coastal wines and think of these types of wines. Generally speaking, there's always going to be exceptions, right? There's less ripeness in the fruit, right? So it's cooler, less sun, maybe there's a marine layer, or it's just generally kind of foggy and cool in general. So the fruit doesn't ripen as much. That's not a bad thing. That's just a generalization. Because of this, the wines will have more tart and bright fruit flavors, which is due to high acidity and low sugar. So less ripe, more acid, less sugar in these wines. Less sugar means less alcohol, right? So if the grapes don't ripen as much, they're going to make low alcohol wines. Sugar is converted to alcohol during the primary fermentation, right? Lower alcohol means lighter bodied wines as well. So if you are confused about body in wine, it's just the mouthfeel. So the best comparison for this is to think about whole milk versus water. Water would be a lighter bodied wine and whole milk would be a full bodied wine, right? So that's the body, it's the weight of the wine. So alcohol does change that perception, right? So on the other hand, we have warm conditions, and this is just the total opposite, right? So think blazing hot sun. It could either be, Sierra foothills or Central Valley, whatever. Typically, more ripe fruits. We do not have any problems ripening fruit. Sugars just go out the window, right? So much sugar in these fruits that get fermented into higher alcohol wines, right? So more ripeness, softer. It's a softer wine, but it's also more fruity. I don't like the sweeter part because the wines aren't necessarily sweet. I would say they're more fruit forward. So lower acidity and higher sugar. Higher sugar means higher alcohol. Higher alcohol means fuller bodied. So that can be a hard concept to grasp, but it's a really important concept to grasp because once you understand this, and you might decide that you have a preference, maybe you prefer a Zinfandel from a cooler climate than a warmer one. Then you can understand wine labels a little bit better, and then you can make better decisions about what wines you purchase. So that's something to think about. Okay, and here's just a really good example of one wine made in 3 different climates and how different it can taste. So this is an example from WSET, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. This is one of the boards you can go to become a sommelier if you want to, and this is their explanation on how Chardonnay tastes different in 3 different climates, right? So first we have a cool climate Chardonnay. Cool climate, super high acid, typically low alcohol, right? So this wine will generally taste like high acid, green fruit. So apple, pear, citrus fruit, lemon, it could be lime, and vegetable too, right? Cucumber. So these are all very typical characteristics and what you would expect of a Chardonnay grown in a cool climate. If it's a moderate climate, and I would say this is like Sierra foothills here, right? You will have some citrus, but also some stone fruit. So peaches, nectarines, something along those lines, right? And then so maybe a little bit of tropical fruit too, right? So mango. Those are all really good things. And it's all a sliding scale, right? So it could be green mango, it could be regular mango, it could be super ripe mango, right? It just depends on when that fruit was picked. Then we have a hot climate. So think Central Valley, think about somewhere that is just blazing hot. Typically you get mostly tropical fruit, but it could lend more towards like banana and pineapple mango, but also potentially some fig and peach. I'd also like to add, like, if it's super hot climate and it's harvested really late, where it's like super high bricks, you could also get like baked fruit flavors. So like pineapple jam, something like that. So it could be it's all super different depending on where the climate it was produced. And that is just very broad general terms. Like it gets even more complex when you talk about the yeast that's being used, whether or not it went through oak, whether or not it went through secondary fermentation, and those are all things that are covered in the winemaking class. So if that interests you, you might want to look into signing up for that class too. But overall, I just think this is a really good example of applying the last slide to a wine that most people know about. Cool. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Winkler Index. So this just applies to climate, specifically through viticulture, because this is a system that was created by Amarine and Winkler. So A.J. Winkler, Maynard Amarine, 2 scientists at UC Davis that created this chart, right? So the Winkler Index is an index that separates different growing regions based off of their growing degree days. So the growing degree days is the sum, so the complete sum of the mean temperatures between April 1st and October 31st. That's generally the growing season window for grapes, right? That's why we set those dates. Those are the dates for grape growing in the United States, and also most parts in the northern hemisphere of the world, right? Southern hemisphere is on a different clock. Their harvest is in the springtime. Our harvest is in the fall. So what we have on the right here is a map, and you can see mapped out are the regions. So you have 1 through 5. 1 being the coolest and 5 being the hottest average degree days, right? So this is a very general thing, right? It's not super, doesn't include all the nuances of all the microclimates within these regions, but it can be helpful when trying to determine what plants you want to, what varieties you want to plant in your vineyard, and maybe some other things you want to consider as well, right? So that's something that can be used. So the Winkler Index was created a long time ago, but in 2021 it was updated to be a little more detailed. And we do apply it to grape growing regions around the world now too. If you wanted to see, I do have this linked here. The Winkler scale, we have a lot more information here too. And if you are interested in like different grape growing regions and what they're like, you know, we don't all have the privilege of being able to go to, you know, across the globe and experience a new wine region. But if you're looking at purchasing a wine in that shelf, you can see the region. You can look up the region that it is, and you might be able to determine like, oh, like, you know, this Syrah from the Barossa Valley is a Winkler region. I'm just going to guess 4 or 5, right? It's a guess. We'll have to fact check that, right? So then you could be like, oh, that's, you know, it's a warmer climate, so it might be like this, right? If you didn't know anything about Australia, that could be something that you could use to piece the puzzle pieces together. That's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, you can look into this if you like. It's a good resource. It's good to know, right? We reference it a lot in the wine industry, so that is important. Okay. Perfect. So here's a good example. I'm going to laugh if Barossa Valley is on here. Okay. So this is a good example of regions and the Winkler Index that it's associated with, right? So region 1A, 1B. 1A, you think about like Chablis, Moselle Valley, and Champagne. These are very cold areas that produce some fantastic white wines, right? Region 1B is slightly warmer than 1A, of course. There we have Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauv Blanc, Riesling, Rhine, also more of the Moselle Valleys, Burgundy, and Willamette Valley in Oregon. Region 2, this is where we have our medium-bodied reds, so this includes Napa, Bordeaux, and the Northern Rhone. Region 3 is a little bit fuller. We have Barossa Valley, Stellenbosch, and the Southern Rhone. And region 4, we have, again, some Napa, some Stellenbosch, but then we kind of move into Tuscany. We see those nice, beautiful reds, right? And this allows for Cab Sauv, Sangiovese, and Syrah. And then region 5 is just like Central Valley, California, Australia, Morocco, Madeira, Apulia, and Jerez. So very, very hot regions of grape growing in the world. So that is just a good example of what that is like. And again, just very broad generalizations. The downfall about the Winkler system is that, like I said, does not give you the nuances of what those areas can contain, right? Like we maybe talked about this earlier, but a good example is here in the Sierra foothills, you know, we're a Winkler Index 4. So we're up there, we're on the toastier side of things, but we produce Pinot Noir here. Not everyone can produce Pinot Noir, but there are certain specialized areas within the higher elevation regions of the Sierra foothills that can grow Pinot Noir and do successfully. So again, the nuances are not represented in the Winkler scale. So there is some faults there. Okay, so here's an example of a cool climate versus a hot climate, right? So this is the Willamette Valley in Oregon. This is the wine region here. As you can see, it's pretty darn close to the coast. So this is a region 1B. This is quite cool. Their average highs from the growing season are anywhere between the mid-70s and the low 80s degrees Fahrenheit. And it rarely ever experiences periods of high 90s or 100s. Must be nice, right? So it's a great area. They specialize in lighter wines like Pinot Noir, it's a lighter red, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauv Blanc, all fantastic crispy whites. Then they have Syrah, Gamay, Gruner, Veltliner, and then Pinot Meunier. So Pinot Meunier is just one of the traditional varieties used in champagne, but Gruner Veltliner is something, it's a white variety from Austria, I believe. Very acidic, very lean. So this really goes towards our chart of hot climate versus cold climate, right? With the cold climate, we typically have lower alcohol, lighter, nuanced wines, right? So very, very nice wines coming from this region. In contrast to that, we have the California Central Valley, which is very hot and very dry. And interestingly enough, Central Valley is not an AVA itself. It also consists of technically two valleys, the Sacramento Valley in the north and the San Joaquin Valley in the south. But this whole area is a Winkler Index Region 5. So it's about as hot as it gets. Average highs for daily temperature between 75 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I do think it's hotter than that now. That's just what Google said, but it gets pretty toasty down there. It just depends to where you're at, right? If you are here close to the bay, you actually do get some nice breezes that funnel in to the central part, the central of Central Valley. But as you go more south, this gets pretty hot in here as well. Anyways, varieties that are grown in this area are very, very different. We're talking like Zinfandel, Cabernet Sauvignon. There is Chardonnay as well, but it's going to be on that warmer style that we talked about up here. So it's going to be more towards that tropical fruit Chardonnay, and definitely not this green apple citrus. Definitely much more tropical. Petit Syrah, Merlot, and then also Chenin Blanc. So these are going to be, generally speaking, higher alcohol wines, bolder wines, and more intense fruit because of that, right? And it goes into that sunshine factor, right? Much more sunshine. California Central Valley is like one of the most fertile soils in the United States. So things just grow really well there. We just need more water. Cool. So that will hopefully give you guys a good backstory onto just very general reasoning behind climate in viticulture. Now we're going to swap over towards climate change in vineyards. So working in the industry, this has become very obvious, and this is, it's an ongoing problem for the whole world and all agriculture, not just wine. It's also being applied to apples and coffee and, everything that we consume with rising temperatures. The regions for agriculture are shifting as to what the most ideal places are for these varieties, and people also are having to reconsider what they should be planting as well, right? So what we have here on the right side is a map of grape expectations, not to be confused with Great Expectations from Charles Dickens, but anyways. So what we have is the map of the world, and the spots in red are the current wine regions. And then the shaded blue is the area with suitable temperatures in 2000. And then the box blue, just the outline, is the area with suitable temperatures in 2100, right? So as you can see, the ideal range for growing viticulture crops for grapes is, if you're in the northern hemisphere, is moving north. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, is moving more south. So generally, as things start to continue to warm and climate is just changing in general, we have to either move more north or more south for the best grape growing regions. So challenges we've had with climate change are drastic weather, right? We've had earlier harvests, extreme heats, earlier frosts too. Just more sporadic weather in general, and then also increased water stress as well. So it's been a bad formula of events. There's been a spread of pests and diseases as well because of this. So it's been warmer, things have been hatching and reproducing when we don't normally have them, and they're becoming more of a problem than they used to be. So that's just kind of a general problem there. In addition, specifically for California, well, other parts of the world, like Australia, but California, we get a lot of this. We get a lot of fire problems. There's a lot of things that are accumulating to these fire issues. So one, the winters are shorter. We don't have as much of the cold, wet season for as long as we used to anymore. The summers are even hotter and even drier. We're also experiencing a huge infestation of bark beetles, which are going through and just wiping out a bunch of trees. So we have a bunch of dead trees that are just sitting around, and they're total tinderbox for these fires. So all politics and anything else aside, generally it's a bad formula. It's a bad a combination of things that lead to higher fire risks in California, which just happened to be situated around the time of harvest, right? So think late summer, early fall, things are really dried out. Typically we're harvesting by then, so it's just not a good time, that's for sure. So those are some of the big things that vineyards are experiencing from climate change. And we also have an Economist article linked up here if you'd like to read more about that. So this is kind of interesting. So what are vineyards doing in response to climate change, right? So one is they're grafting over or planting with new varieties. So it's not happening right now, but it's actually estimated that Oregon will be the next Napa, because the ideal region for growing is moving north. So, but with that being said, Oregon will not be known for Pinot anymore at that point. They'll be known for Cabernet Sauvignon. So Pinot typically does much better in a cooler region. It might be able to retain some cool areas by the coast, but generally speaking, the temperature will rise, so they will most likely have to graft over from Pinot to Cab. That's just a good example of how things will change, right? Something that is current and that's happening right now is that with temperatures rising, it's working out well for some regions, like the UK, which we'll talk about in a second, who's now producing world-renowned sparkling or champagne or traditional method sparkling wine, right? But in places like Germany, who invented ice wine, it's getting so warm in Germany that producers are not able to produce ice wine anymore. It's not getting cold enough for the grapes to freeze on the vine to produce ice wine. So that's very sad, right? So this is kind of a summation of some things that are happening too, right? So what can we do? We can try to plant new varieties. We can also move to higher altitudes. So Sierra Foothills is doing generally pretty well, besides the fires. But high elevation, it keeps it relatively cooler. The higher you move in elevation, the cooler it gets, right? If you can get drought-resistant rootstocks, then you should be pretty good, or have some shade management. Maybe that will help with the temperature, right? But it's interesting to see how the UK, which was once too cold to ever consider being a wine region, with recent climate change, now they're able to produce wine. And a funny thing too is this map on the right here. This is a map of Britain. This is a estimate for what the wine regions of Britain will look like in 2100. So pretty crazy. So not right now. They are producing some wine, but this is an estimate as to what the regions will look like and what it would produce. So if you want to read more about that, we have it linked here. It's a Decanter article. And then we also have another article here from the BBC about how English wine is rivaling champagne. So again, with temperatures rising, the Champagne region of France is getting too warm to produce the quality that they want for those wines, while the UK is on the rise. So very interesting how that is going. Cool. And then that completes us up with the learning objectives. I'll type these in before I post it online for you guys. But I hope that was a helpful presentation. Hope you learned something new. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Definitely check out the textbooks. Always a great resource. And as always, I look forward to seeing you guys next time.